My stomach was twisted with wild hunger, demanding at least a piece of food. He watched with envy as the stranger greedily bit into the juicy meat. Watching this shameless feast was real torture for the guy. A sudden sharp shout made him flinch, breaking him out of his hungry trance. A haughty aristocrat towered over him, shouting about the family's dishonor. With an expression of disgust, she threw a coin at him as if it were a handout. The impact of the metal on the skin burned not only the face, but also the pride. The gold coins fell with a clink onto the cold pavement stones. She expected gratitude, making him crawl in the dust for money. Her contemptuous look reminded him of his own mediocrity and insignificance. The knights mocked him, calling his torment a just retribution for his mistakes. As he crawled away, his tormentors looked at him with disgust. Suddenly, a strange sound distracted them from mocking the cowering boy. A heavy boot crunched down, punishing him for his pitiful appearance. A powerful kick sent the poor fellow flying painfully. As he wheezed, the warrior disdainfully compared him to a worm. The boot pressed his face mercilessly into the ground, forcing him to stand up. But then the blonde intervened, furiously ordering Rafal to stop. Having recognized Roxy's replacement, the aggressor reluctantly retreated from the victim. As they left, the trio snapped back, advising her to pay closer attention to the fast. Roxy sat down next to him, anxiously checking on the injured Faith. The guy froze, amazed that she remembered his name. Embarrassed, he hastened to refuse thanks, citing subordination. But the girl firmly promised to protect him from further bullying. Fearing that she was in trouble, Faith waved his hands nervously, and then suddenly he rushed away, leaving Roxy bewildered. He ran away as fast as he could, just to avoid exposing his savior. After all, the Holy Knight has his own high path of serving the kingdom. Hungry Faith wandered sadly down the street, dreaming of being satisfied. And then thoughts returned to the cruel law of this world about skills. In this world, everyone received a unique divine skill from birth. But the cursed gluttony of Faith brought only a brutal, insatiable hunger. He considered himself a mistake of nature against the backdrop of the shining Holy Knights. There was no point in fighting the elite. All that was left was to silently endure the beatings. Dark thoughts about Rafal's cruelty did not leave him even in the city. The guy was worried that these bastards would harm the noble Roxy. Suddenly he noticed her silhouette, frozen alone with a spear in the alley. And behind the city wall, thieves were already clambering deftly, taking advantage of the darkness. The intruders slipped into the blind spot, remaining invisible to the guard. Faith immediately rushed to help to warn about the threat. The guy ran up to the post, calling out loudly to the surprised Roxy. He reported anxiously about bandits who had secretly climbed over the wall. The knight clarified the details, and Faith firmly confirmed the threat. Roxy immediately pulled herself together, accepting the challenge with a serious expression. She entrusted him with guarding the gate, heading out to intercept. The warrior drew her sword, ready to rush into the thick of the battle. Faith intercepted the spear, wishing her good luck sincerely. The blonde gave him a confident smile, promising to sort everything out. And then she quickly rushed off, full of determination to stop the enemies. Left alone, the boy anxiously clutched the weapon he had been entrusted with. At that moment, Faith was surprised by the sudden dead silence. He nervously wondered if Roxy had already dealt with all the enemies. Suddenly, the bloody carcass of a wounded bandit tumbled out of the darkness. The one-armed brute looked like a hunted animal, ready to kill to save himself. The criminal barked, ordering the small fry to get out of the way immediately. Faith panicked as he realized that one enemy had finally broken through. But we can't back down. Otherwise, the blame for the failure will fall on Roxy. With a wild cry, the boy blindly jabbed his spear at the attacker. The tip sank into the flesh with relish, stopping the dying enemy's charge. The bandit fell down dead, and Faith looked in amazement at his own handiwork. Faith stood frozen in shock as he looked at the bloody aftermath of the blow. Suddenly, the system reported that his cursed skill had absorbed his power. The guy felt with horror how someone else's power filled his body. Then Roxy came running up, out of breath, panicking about his condition. She touched his shoulder guiltily, noticing the guy's unnatural pallor. Faith flinched, afraid that she would find out about his murder. He jumped back sharply, trying to hide his trembling and fear. The guy smiled falsely, assuring that everything was fine with him. Roxy believed him and dropped her hands onto her shoulders with relief. The Holy Knight was sincerely glad that the poor fellow remained safe. Faith stood there stunned, trying to comprehend the strange surge of power. He immediately asked Roxy to take credit for the victory over the enemies. The girl was indignant, considering it dishonest to hide his heroic act. But the guy insisted, fearing new problems from the cruel Rafal. Roxy resigned herself, closing her eyes and reluctantly accepting his terms. She promised to sort everything out, sincerely thanking her humble assistant. The knight smiled softly, insisting that she owed him. After all, without his vigilance, the honor of her family would have been destroyed. Faith waved his hands in panic, flatly refusing the reward. Roxy pouted comically, clearly offended by his stubborn refusal. The guy was surprised to see such vivid emotions on her face. Roxy placed her finger to her lips thoughtfully, choosing the perfect reward. Suddenly her face lit up, because an excellent solution had been found. The girl cheerfully suggested that he join the Hearts' service. The guy stepped back in shock, unable to believe such luck. He clenched his fist, remembering the useless skill and its current owners. But Roxy gently reassured him, telling him not to worry unnecessarily. The knight reasonably asked whether he really wanted to endure the humiliation of tyrants forever. Faith bowed gratefully, readily accepting his new fate. Roxy said a warm goodbye, sending the tired boy home to rest. Roxy smiled warmly, inviting him to the estate in 2 days. Faith bowed deeply, thanking him with all his heart for this chance. Tears of happiness gushed from my eyes, washing away the tension of the terrible night. At home, he collapsed exhausted onto the prickly straw, falling asleep. Suddenly he opened his eyes sharply, emerging from oblivion. The guy sat up, suspecting that yesterday's events were just a dream. But the memories of the battle and Roxy's smile seemed too real. He remembered the mechanical voice talking about gaining rare skills. Suddenly, a blue window with personal data opened before my eyes. Faith was stunned to see monstrous 3-digit numbers instead of the usual ones. The boy realized that the strange voice announced the awakening of skills. He wondered how exactly gluttony had affected Roxy's touch. It turned out that the cursed gift devours souls, granting long-awaited satisfaction. Faith realized that by killing his enemies, he was taking their power for himself. For the first time in my life, excruciating hunger was replaced by pleasant satiety. A predatory smile played on his lips. Now the rules of the game had changed. With renewed vigor, a daring plan matured in his soul. In the morning, Faith was already walking along the crowded streets of the shopping district. The Seyfarth market was bustling, beckoning rich and poor alike with its shop windows. But only the last 2 coins jingled forlornly in his palm. Faith stood hesitantly at the threshold, not daring to go inside. The old man at the entrance suddenly called out to him, offering to pick up the weapon. The merchant laughed, easily guessing the boy's obvious intentions. The shop owner invited the customer with a broad gesture to inspect the goods. Faith beamed, delighted at the chance to finally buy a sword. But then the old man asked him about his budget in a businesslike manner. The guy awkwardly showed off all his wealth, 2 silver coins. The merchant's face instantly turned sour at the sight of the measly pennies. He crossed his arms, dismissively calling the visitor a pathetic pauper. The old man pointed to a basket of cheap, rusty junk. The merchant burst out laughing, calling this trash the perfect choice for such a ragamuffin. Faith resigned himself to the fact that he was not welcome in other places either. The boy desperately reached for the basket, trying to find at least some semblance of a weapon. He squatted down, looking longingly at the rusty pile of useless scrap. The hand instinctively lay on the black handle in a faint hope of a miracle. Suddenly the sword clearly ordered to buy it, sounding right in the guy's head. Faith recoiled in horror, staring dumbfounded at the talking piece of metal. The black blade vibrated ominously, as if it had its own dark and ancient mind. The merchant barked irritably, demanding that he either buy or get out. The guy looked around, shocked to realize that only he had heard the strange voice. Faith reached out cautiously towards the black blade, feeling a strange, frightening pull. The sword suddenly spoke in his head. Surprised that the boy had not run away, Faith swung the weapon, wondering if it was cursed, as it looked normal. Deciding to test his guesses, he immediately activated his assessment skill. But the system only gave out that his name was Greed, and his weapon type. The guy was surprised to see that absolutely all of the blade's characteristics were hidden. He realized with bitterness that this sword was despised just as much as he was. Suddenly, a voice in his head brazenly asked if he would buy it. Faith decided that this blade was the only one that looked even slightly decent here. Happy, he picked up the sword, feeling that he and the weapon were alike. The blade pathetically vowed to accompany him for eternity, asking the owner's name. Faith introduced himself with a smile and asked about the name of his new companion. The sword called itself Greed, arrogantly demanding to be proud of such an acquisition. The idyll was interrupted by the cry of the merchant, enraged by the long examination of the goods. Faith silently threw the money down, leaving the old man in a complete stupor. The shopkeeper instantly changed his anger to mercy, fawning over the customer. But the guy only snapped back angrily, saying goodbye to this place forever. He went outside, deciding to test the new thing on the nearest goblins. Greed immediately cooled his ardor, warning him against overconfidence. Faith nodded confidently, remembering the old lesson about the peculiarities of these creatures. Faith immediately remembered the strange old man's story about the habits of goblins. Soon he reached the crowded southern gate of the capital. The area was swarming with heavily armored warriors, preparing to launch a sortie. Faith realized that this was where they were gathering troops before the big hunt. He dreamed of his partners, but the sword jealously reminded him of itself. His thoughts were interrupted by a stranger's call, causing the guy to flinch in surprise. A friendly warrior offered to join forces right now. Faith almost jumped for joy when he learned that the seat was available. But then a potential partner casually asked about his current level. Faith proudly shouted out his first level with a beaming smile. Faith was left alone in the crowd, and the sword grinned sarcastically. Greed sneered, because no one needs a first-level partner. The guy wilted, painfully realizing the collapse of his naive hopes. The voice sternly warned that gluttony should not be revealed to people. Faith froze, amazed by the blade's knowledge of its secret. He quickly realized that it was better to keep such a skill quiet, because if people find out the truth, they will simply kill him. But this dark force promised absolute power over enemies. Faith grinned predatorily, accepting the cruel rules of this game. He raised his fist in victory, declaring a goblin hunt. Faith reached a field south of the capital that had become home to goblins. These creatures attacked carts, mercilessly robbing everyone passing by. Hiding in the tall grass, the boy with a predatory smile tracked down his target. The enemy slept carefree, completely alone, unaware of the danger. The assessment revealed the third level and the skill of minor strength enhancement. Faith immediately realized that he was superior to this monster in every respect. Seeing his enemy completely exposed, he decided not to delay his attack. Clutching his sword, the boy suddenly jumped out of cover for a fatal blow. The goblin's eyes widened in horror, seeing imminent death before him. The blow activated gluttony, and Faith greedily absorbed the fallen enemy's power. Faith stared in shock at the monster he had defeated. The system immediately notified about the assignment of someone else's strength skill. The guy checked his status, admiring the sharp jump in his stats. He realized with delight that he was indeed becoming stronger. The sword grumbled and knocked down his arrogance, reminding him that the day was not endless. Faith justified himself by saying that for the first time he didn't run away from danger. He then pragmatically set about collecting trophies from the corpse. The boy cut off the goblin's ears to exchange them for money. Even a small reward made him happier than working as a guard. Wiping away a tear of happiness, Faith eagerly announced the search for the next victim. Suddenly he noticed a goblin who was covering himself with a round iron shield. The guy immediately activated the assessment, suspecting a new species in front of him. It turned out to be a goblin guard, and his defense looked like a real problem. Faith realized that the monsters worked in pairs, covering each other's weaknesses. He decided to attack a regular fighter first to break their formation. But a hard block with a shield could have been fatal for him. Having no experience, he gripped the sword tighter for a sure blow. Seizing his moment, Faith rushed forward in a swift and furious attack. The goblin raised his shield, and Faith foresaw failure with horror. But the sword cut through the metal, allowing gluttony to drink up the enemy's strength. Faith froze in shock, as his sword effortlessly cut through the iron shield. The blade finished off the enemy with a crunch, instantly draining his life energy. The guy was surprised not to receive the expected skill from this monster, but the status showed that he was accumulating different buffs at the same time. He realized that in order to gain new strength, he would have to exterminate different types of creatures. The guy sincerely didn't understand why such a blade was considered trash. Having learned that the sword itself chooses its owner, Faith grinned contentedly. He mentally vowed to become a worthy owner for this grump. The hunt went like clockwork, yielding a mountain of valuable trophies. Shining Faith took one last look at his incredible progress. Faith stared in amazement at his incredibly increased combat stats. The level froze at 1, although the strength had exceeded 1,000. The voice explained that he was committing sacrilege by rejecting the divine system. Stealing someone else's skills violated the sacred law of accumulating experience. Faith realized with dismay that he was now an outcast. Suddenly, greed abruptly ended the conversation, which greatly puzzled the owner. Sword suggested returning to the city while the sun was still high. Faith agreed, feeling a brutal hunger after such a successful hunt. Clutching the trophies, he was already dreaming of a battle with the hobgoblin. Soon, the satisfied miner mingled with the motley crowd on the streets. Faith timidly entered the noisy guild, frightened by the chaos that reigned there. The guy hesitated at the counter when a pretty girl called the next customer. Faith breathed a huge sigh of relief, glad that he hadn't been chased away. He confidently placed the heavy bag on the table for the exchange of loot. The girl gasped when she saw a huge pile of green goblin ears inside. The employee asked anxiously about aggro, surprising the guy with an unfamiliar word. It turns out that the mass extermination of monsters attracts vengeful relatives of those killed. Faith smiled awkwardly, finally realizing the reason for the recent goblin invasion. The girl praised him warmly, mistaking the rags for traces of a heated battle. Faith hissed angrily at the chatty sword, startling the confused employee. Faith laughed nervously, attributing the strange voice to the noisy crowd around him. The girl told him to wait for the reward while the guy tried to calm his frayed nerves. Faith was already dreamily going over options for a hearty dinner in her mind. Greed disgustedly demanded that he be immediately washed of the dirty blood. The blade haughtily declared that caring for it was more important than any food. Faith scratched the back of his head, agreeing to look for a forge for the capricious weapon. The satisfied guy said goodbye politely and walked out into the sun-drenched street. The heavy bag of coins felt pleasantly and noticeably heavy on my hand. In half a day he earned more than in 5 years of service. Faith mentally buried past grievances, deciding to live a new life. Clenching his fist, Faith firmly promised himself to look only to the future. The sword immediately began to nag that it required special care. The guy just figured that paying the blacksmith every day would be ruinous. Remembering their battles, he realized he would have to repair the blade himself. Faith cheered up and decided to buy tools right after eating. Today he could finally afford a truly luxurious dinner. The hungry hero was already dreaming of a juicy, fatty piece of meat. The intoxicating smell of roast literally dragged him to the door. He pushed the door open with determination, ready to throw a feast. Suddenly he flew at full speed into a huge giant. The blow sent Faith and the unfamiliar girl flying head over heels onto the floor. The bald brute roared, attacking the guy for his night blindness. Faith was surprised, not expecting such aggression out of the blue. The big guy roughly lifted the little girl up, almost dislocating her arm. The guy instinctively reached out to them, trying to stop this chaos. The mercenary's heavy paw painfully squeezed the child's fragile shoulder. The girl, in tears, silently begged him for salvation. Faith froze, as if struck by an electric shock by her desperate gaze. The big man dragged the child away, not paying attention to anyone. Faith stood there in a stupor, trying to process what had happened. Faith doubted that this rude man was really the girl's father. To test his guess, he used assessment on the departing thug. The guy was confused, because for some reason the skill did not show any information. The sword explained. The enemy's status is hidden by a special masking skill. Then a voice in his head sarcastically inquired about Faith's future plans. The weapon warned that this warrior was stronger than the boy, but more terrible than the stats was that eerie, icy gaze of the killer. Faith's blood ran cold as he realized the girl was being led to certain death. With a heavy sigh, the hero decided to sacrifice the long-awaited dinner for the sake of salvation. His conscience did not allow him to stay away, and he went. The sword suddenly decided to philosophize and give the guy some unsolicited advice. The voice sarcastically reminded about mercy for those who thirst for blood. Faith countered that taking a person's life was still wrong. He looked down, admitting that he wasn't trying to be a hero. However, his conscience simply did not allow him to ignore the suffering of others. Hiding around the corner, Faith suspected that they wanted to sell the girl. Both options sounded lousy, and the guy shuddered with anger. Climbing to the window, he saw the tied-up captive and the kidnapper. The worst fears were confirmed. This was a real kidnapping. Suddenly, the scoundrel slapped the child with all his might. The sadist grinned, noting that threats made children surprisingly obedient. He contemptuously ridiculed the little girl for her supposedly worthless skill. Faith winced as he saw his own past in the scene. Painful memories of endless childhood humiliations came flooding back to me. The sword immediately ordered the guy, seething with rage, to calm down. And the kidnapper was already looking forward to using his new toy. He advanced slowly, reveling in his absolute power over his victim. Grabbing the baby by the hair, the bastard threatened her with imminent death. Suddenly, he rushed at her with a wild cry like a beast, and without mercy, he kicked the lying girl with all his might. Faith opened his mouth to scream, but suddenly froze. The sword warned in an icy tone that emotions are death. The experience of an assassin was far more dangerous than just high stats. The guy managed to stop shaking and promised to pull himself together. He was tormented by the thought that he could do nothing. But suddenly he noticed some boxes that he could use as cover. As soon as the tormentor left, Faith knew it was time to act. Without a second's hesitation, he jumped straight into the dungeon. The hero smiled at the stunned girl, announcing his rescue. The black blade cut through the thick chains of the shackles with a ringing sound. Faith took a quick look at the captive and ordered her to run away immediately. He helped the girl up, asking if she could walk. Suddenly, a huge, ominous shadow covered the trembling couple. The bald giant returned, mocking the young hero's stupidity. The killer drew his blade, anticipating a bloody massacre of his savior. The sadist demanded loud screams before finishing off his victim. Faith's heart sank as he realized he was trapped. The maniac burst out laughing, glad that his prey had come to him. The guy's hands began to shake treacherously, and fear gripped his body. The giant mockingly remarked that the hero could barely stand on his feet. The sword sharply commanded to grab the girl and get out of here immediately. Faith was surprised when the voice reminded him of what he had just done. Looking at the severed chains, the boy realized the hidden power of the blade. He abruptly grabbed the little girl by the hand and dragged her away. The maniac just laughed after them, anticipating a fun hunt. Suddenly, the fugitives froze, finding themselves in a dead end of boxes. The killer slowly cornered them, declaring the game over. Faith pushed the girl behind him, ordering her not to stick her head out. The brute loomed over them, grinning as he offered them a final prayer. The sword gave the command, and the boy rushed forward in despair. The brute burst out laughing, considering the guy's frontal attack the height of idiocy. But Faith nimbly slid out of the way of the fatal blow. The killer's eyes widened in shock as the blade cut only air. A second later, the bandit collapsed to the floor, covering the boards with blood. The sword dryly praised its owner for successfully provoking the enemy. Faith smiled, attributing the victory to greed's timely hint. Suddenly he grabbed the dying man harshly, demanding that he name the person who had ordered the murder. The hero threatened to read his mind if the bastard didn't talk. The mercenary, choking, squeezed out the hated name of Hadu with difficulty. Faith's face darkened as he realized that the whole damn family was involved. Faith grimly promised that one day they would all pay, and then gluttony greedily absorbed the enemy's skills and stats. Now the hero mastered the deadly art of the one-handed sword. The boy was amazed as he felt his body fill with the skill of a warrior. Looking at the corpse, he realized with a shudder that he had survived. Suddenly, the girl's loud rumbling stomach broke the tense situation. Faith grinned and led the rescued woman to a warm establishment. Soon, a fragrant stew and fresh bread were steaming in front of them. The guy good-naturedly pushed the plate towards his shy companion. The girl literally beamed with happiness, stuffing her cheeks with the delicious treat. Faith and the baby raced to eat the long-awaited delicious dinner. It turned out that the girl lives in a shelter in her native slums. At the gate, the hero said a warm goodbye, stroking the baby on the head. Suddenly, she unexpectedly called the savior her older brother. The child's sincere gratitude touched Faith to the very depths of his soul. The girl waved her hand joyfully, running away under the nun's wing. Faith turned and wandered alone through the dark streets. Sword immediately noticed the strange, complex expression on his partner's face. The guy just sighed, realizing what a long journey lay ahead of him. The upcoming visit to Roxy's estate caused him great anxiety. The sword sarcastically reminded the guy of his family's status, making him nervous. The blade merely laughed at his nervousness, pretending to be an innocent weapon. Faith was hysterical about the closed shops, and the sword called him noisy. Having dressed up, he hoped not to disgrace Roxy with his new appearance. The sword's caustic compliment instantly infuriated the embarrassed boy. The crazy events of the last few days flashed through my head like a dream. And then he froze in front of the giant gates of the great estate. The guard politely called out to the guy, bringing him out of his deep stupor. Faith quickly introduced himself, stating his appointment with Roxy. The soldier checked the list, confirming this unexpected visit. The guard politely called the frozen guy to follow him. Faith was stunned by the incredible beauty hidden behind the high walls. But in the luxurious garden, surprisingly, there was complete silence. He was surprised by the desertedness, and asked his guide about the employment of the other servants. A girl appeared ahead, and the soldier loudly announced the arrival of a guest. Roxy turned around, beaming in her unfamiliar house dress. Faith was speechless, blinded by her sudden transformation. Hearing the confused compliment, the lady instantly blushed brightly. She sheepishly admitted that she simply loves to dress up sometimes, and then she teased the guy that she barely recognized him either. They walked silently past the mansion, deep into the shady garden. Faith looked back at the house, puzzled, not understanding the route of the walk. Soon they stood frozen in front of the knight's majestic tomb. Roxy knelt down, laying flowers on the cold stone. Her vow to restore the house to its former glory amazed the boy. It turned out that the tragedy happened just 5 days ago. The news of my father's death in Gaul came only recently. It was teeming with terrible monsters that no one could compare to. Faith realized the hellish pain she was hiding behind her smile. After all, the duty of a holy knight is an eternal battle with these creatures. Faith was horrified at the thought of the power of such terrible monsters. But Roxy suddenly announced that it was not a monster that killed her father. She asked the boy about the legendary living disaster of Gallia. Faith instantly remembered the creepy stories about the heavenly dragon. This creature possessed the destructive power of a true natural cataclysm. The dragon suddenly destroyed her father's entire army at the border. Such tragedies have not happened in the kingdom for decades. Faith wondered painfully why she looked so broken. But Roxy was determined to restore her family's status. And then she hopefully asked Faith for help. Roxy vowed at her father's grave to do anything for her family. Faith stretched with pleasure in the rays of the bright morning sun. The guy greeted the beginning of another calm, wonderful day with a smile. In the garden, he cheerfully exchanged a few words with the old gardener. Faith realized that peaceful gardening suited him best. He thoughtfully decided that the huge tree would soon have to be trimmed. In the evening, a noisy and cheerful company gathered around the common table. The guy's eyes lit up with delight at the sight of a huge piece of meat. The servants laughed good-naturedly at his brutal appetite during dinner. Faith enjoyed the peace, forgetting about the cruelty of Rafal and the knights. He bit into the meat greedily, feeling a sudden and unnatural surge of hunger. This frightening feeling painfully reminded him of that very first time. Reality suddenly cracked, and his name echoed heavily in his head. Faith flinched in surprise, shouting some absurd and incoherent sounds. Roxy froze in bewilderment, looking with alarm at his sudden panic. She reached out to check his forehead, but the guy recoiled in horror. Faith waved his hands nervously, with a forced smile, assuring him of his health. But consciousness treacherously collapsed into a swirling blood-red whirlpool of darkness. The image of the frightened girl turned over and disappeared as he fell into oblivion. With a heavy groan, the boy emerged from the nightmare, waking up in a soft bed. Faith jumped up abruptly, realizing that hunger had simply knocked him out. There was a white note from Roxy nearby, ordering her to take the day off. The guy covered his face with his hand, burning with shame for his fainting. It was already dark outside. He had been unconscious and asleep all day. He asked the sword why this attack of hunger was so strong. A voice in my head cut me off, saying that the die was cast and there was no way out. Gluttony became a taste, growing stronger with each soul consumed. This is the exhaustion mode. The skill will require more and more blood. He told him to look at himself in the mirror immediately. A red eye glowed in the reflection, a terrible sign of his curse. Faith recoiled in horror as he listened to the icy verdict of his imminent death. He timidly asked if it was possible to simply stop absorbing other people's souls. Greed responded with a vision of Faith being driven by a mad hunger to kill Roxy. The guy turned pale, refusing to believe in the inevitability of this bloody nightmare. The sword pressed mercilessly, repeating that it would not be possible to resist nature for long. It is no longer possible to remain a peaceful servant. The beast inside demands an outlet. Faith tightened his gloves resolutely, accepting the fact that there was no turning back. Under the full moon, he ran out of the city, leaving his past life behind. It was not fatigue that tormented him, but a maddening, animal-like hunger. Suddenly he stopped abruptly, smelling the sweet scent of prey in the air. As he passed the guards, he could hardly contain himself from the sweet scent of souls. The guard called out to him sympathetically, noticing the boy's strange and painful pose. Faith gritted his teeth, trying his best to suppress the animalistic lust for murder. With a sharp movement, he made the guards flinch and recoil in fear. Having thrown out a routine word of praise, he flew past the stunned guards like a bullet. Already in the darkness, the sword explained that the red eyes were to blame. For the predator, any weakling now looked like a tasty piece of meat. Gluttony distorted perception, causing people to see only as prey. Greed reassured him that the guards simply mistook him for a creepy weirdo, although his twitchy behavior looked much more suspicious than the eyes themselves. Amidst the bustle of the city, Faith suddenly caught another enticing scent. This delicious smell emanated from the departing trio in long cloaks. The guy peered into the darkness and froze in shock, recognizing familiar faces. It was Rafal and his retinue, hiding under dark hoods. Faith wondered why the holy knights lurked in the shadows like criminals. They were clearly up to something nasty, disappearing into the dark alleys of the city. But a wild hunger twisted his stomach, forcing the guy to run away. The predator's attention immediately switched to the group of delicious-smelling mercenaries. They were happily discussing the night hunt for monsters under the bright moon. They dreamed of easy money, not feeling the gaze of the beast on themselves. Faith realized that there was no time, and hurried to meet the prey. The mercenaries only rudely ridiculed his loneliness and cheap equipment. They mockingly invited the pathetic weakling to join their hunt. Amidst their laughter, Faith could barely contain the beast that was bursting to get out. The boy ignored the taunts, jumping into the darkness towards the real monsters. The black blade, lightning fast, cut off the head of the goblin who jumped out to meet him. Faith didn't stop, demanding even more blood to saturate him. With wild eyes, he furiously cut down his enemies one after another. Soon the grass around him was strewn with the corpses of fallen creatures. But even this massacre only barely dulled his hellish hunger. In the blade's reflection, a red eye glowed, demanding even more souls. Faith realized with annoyance that small goblins were not enough for him. I had to go deeper into the forest to look for larger prey. Walking through the grass, he felt an unnatural surge of animal strength. This power seethed in the body, helping to quickly feed the insatiable gluttony. This thicket was inhabited by evolved and dangerous creatures, hobgoblins. The monsters were divided into fierce fighters, strong guards, and archers. Faith tensed, remembering the poisonous arrowheads the archers had. He mentally thanked the servant who had once warned him about this infection. And finally, the silhouettes of his new victim loomed ahead. Faith eagerly assessed the enemy's stats, singling out the fat guard with stamina. The hunter, his scarlet eye flashing from ambush, prepared for a deadly dash. The black blade instantly pierced the creature's throat, cutting off its cry for help. Gluttony growled contentedly, absorbing new skills and satisfying its hellish hunger. Feeling a surge of strength, Faith calmly moved further into the forest. Soon he stood among a mountain of corpses, having already counted 45 victims. Suddenly the bloody haze lifted, returning his eyes to their usual blue color. The terrible exhaustion ended, and the boy collapsed under a tree with relief. The sword immediately ordered to climb up before the hero was eaten. After all, without the madness bonuses, Faith became easy prey again. Faith let out a sigh of relief, feeling the agonizing hunger finally subside. He was determined to hunt every night so as not to harm people. Having settled down on a branch, the guy was already getting ready to return to the city. But suddenly a huge green hand grabbed his leg. From below came the wild roar of a giant goblin who had caught his prey. Faith hung helplessly upside down in the monster's steel grip. He froze in horror, noticing a person in the other paw. It turned out to be the same mercenary who had recently mocked him. The evaluation showed the incredible characteristics of the ferocious boss, the Goblin King. Faith's blood ran cold as he realized that fighting him meant certain death. Faith looked at the regeneration skill with envy, wishing he could absorb it. Having assessed the forces, he realized that a frontal attack would be suicide. But determination outweighed fear, and the hunter began to descend from the tree. Beneath the gloomy branches, the Goblin King calmly dealt with his helpless victim. Faith froze in horror, seeing a human body in the creature's paws. The sword sarcastically noted his fear, mocking the boy's naivety. A voice in my head indifferently explained that people here were just food. Faith barely held back the urge to vomit, begging his partner to shut up right now. He knew the theory, but the reality turned out to be far more nightmarish than any stories. The sight of gnawed human bones on the grass shocked the guy. Faith set his mind to the fight, casting aside his doubts. He decided to go around the tree and attack from behind. The boy crept through the grass, trying to convince himself not to rush. Faith froze behind the trunk, preparing to strike from behind. With a sudden jerk, he slashed his sword across the monster's back. Faith landed, reminding himself that it was too early to relax. But the wounded giant stood firm, and the sword warned of danger. The goblin, in a rage, unleashed his might on the tree. Faith barely avoided the blow, hearing his partner's warnings. A huge club whistled past him. Faith made a sliding tackle at the last moment, avoiding certain death. The guy understood that one hit from this club would simply flatten him. But the sword in his head brazenly declared that the monster was a mere trifle. Faith swallowed his fear and decided to trust the black blade completely. And suddenly, in one fell swoop, he cut off the monster's paw along with the weapon. Without losing momentum, the hero rushed towards the stunned enemy to finish him off. The goblin howled wildly as the blade mercilessly ripped through his chest. Faith's final blow put a fat and bloody end to the fight. Suddenly, Gluttony activated, sucking the regeneration skill out of the corpse. The boy collapsed, exhausted, listening to the sword's praise for the unlocked rank. The news of the first rank unlocking took the guy by surprise. The sword explained that it changes shape, draining the owner's characteristics. The price turned out to be exorbitant. To give up absolutely all the accumulated points. Faith was taken aback by the brazen nature of the weapon. Greed harshly threatened to screw him over if he held back payment. Blade posed the question point blank, to level up solo or with him. Faith just chuckled, amazed at the appetite of his talkative partner. The answer was obvious, and the boy's hand decisively closed on the hilt. Now they have become official partners, bound by a common thirst for power. The sword flashed happily, ensuring that the boy would not regret the deal. Suddenly, the blade in the boy's hands flashed with a furious golden light. The sword itself rose into the air, beginning a rapid transformation of form. Faith turned pale as he saw his powerful stats plummet to the bottom. The glow faded, revealing to the world a black bow, a weapon of the first rank. Greed explained that it would now be useful in 2 ways at once. But then he stunned me with the news about the existence of the second and third ranks. Sword added sarcastically that the price for them would be simply astronomical. The guy just swallowed nervously, realizing the scale of his weapon's appetite. Suddenly Greed barked, warning of an attack from behind. Faith dodged the sharp crystal flying at him in panic. The sword's voice warned that invisible arrows were already leading the guy. Faith fell like a stone, letting death whistle over his head. The hero pressed himself against the ogre's corpse, hiding from the heavy fire. Greed explained that to hit the target, all that was needed was a rough direction. Faith was surprised when the arrows themselves were woven from pure mana. He excitedly pulled back the bowstring, forming a projectile that hummed with energy. The magic arrow, ignoring obstacles, cut off half of the goblin's head. Somewhere in the bushes, the last hapless shooter choked on his scream. The guy ironically assessed the skill of his defeated enemy, standing over the corpse. Pleased with the hunt, he hurried back to the city before sunrise. Faith decided not to take the trophy in order to remain in the shadows. The next day, a sudden knock on the door pulled the boy out of a deep sleep. Sleepy Faith opened the door and froze from the unexpected visit. Roxy was beaming at the door, holding a basket of grapes. The girl inquired with genuine concern about her subordinate's well-being. The guy panicked when the lady confidently stepped into his room. Roxy touched his forehead, checking for fever, which completely confused Faith. She joyfully announced that she had come to visit the sick man with gifts. The freshest grapes were delivered directly from the family plantations of the House of Heart. Faith accepted the gift with delight, listening to the story of the lady's lands. Roxy playfully handed him the ripest and most juicy berry. Faith instantly blushed, embarrassed by his mistress's openness. He timidly accepted the basket, nodding at the words about the tasty treat. The idyll was abruptly interrupted by the gloomy figure of the maid appearing behind him. Roxy turned around in fear, resignedly accepting the inevitability of her work duties. The stern woman literally dragged her mistress away, ordering Faith to continue resting. Finally, Roxy hopefully suggested to the guy that they go to the estate together. The door slammed shut, leaving the hero alone in the middle of an empty, quiet room. Faith felt a pang of sadness as he thought about the girl's constant busyness. A desire was born in his soul to become the one who could help her. But reality cruelly reminded them of the gap between their statuses. Throwing aside his gloomy thoughts, Faith remembered his day off. The guy instantly perked up, deciding to spend the day usefully. The bright sun greeted him on the noisy streets of the shopping district. Faith wandered between the stalls with interest, using his appraisal skill. The ability to see the essence of things has proven incredibly useful for shopping. The hero's attention was drawn to a creepy skull mask on the counter. Pleased with his purchase, he walked away with his new accessory. The mask was ideal for concealing identity during night hunts. Suddenly he heard disturbing rumors about a mountain of corpses in the forest. The crowd buzzed, attributing the massacre in the forest to an unknown monster. Faith froze when he heard that the Blaric Knights had taken over the case. Images of arrogant and cruel aristocrats appeared before my eyes. People foolishly rejoiced at the intervention of these dangerous hypocrites. The guy could barely contain his rage, knowing their background very well. Suddenly he realized that this chaos was perfect for his plans. Thoughts returned to the trophies taken from the Goblin King. The nun winced as a sack was thrown at the door of the shelter. Inside were the ears of a monster, which were a huge amount of money for orphans. Faith went into the shadows, giving the reward to those in need. Faith was relieved to learn that the orphans were finally fed and happy. The whole city was now in an uproar, searching for the mysterious, generous hero. The guy just chuckled, hoping that this fuss would distract unnecessary attention. Meanwhile, in the forest, the goblin froze, noticing a shadow falling from the sky. The warrior in the skull mask attacked the monster in the moonlight. The black blade cut through the flesh with lightning speed, leaving a trail of blood in the air. After a successful hunt, Faith sank heavily onto a log to catch his breath. The hero gloomily vowed to himself never to suffer from hunger again. Looking at the stars, he thought with alarm of the Holy Knights. My intuition told me that these arrogant aristocrats were plotting something sinister. Faith admitted with annoyance that the enemies had left no traces. Donning a creepy mask, he decided to become the bait himself. Suddenly, the hunter's instinct made him turn around sharply. Below, among the trees, a detachment of 3 people appeared. The guy grinned. The warriors had just run into an ambush. The newcomers were brave, preparing to fight back against the ferocious hobgoblins. The leader hissed at the others, afraid to summon the forest monster. Casting aside their fear, the trio rushed into the attack with a cry. The fighters clashed fiercely with the monsters head-on. Suddenly, an invisible shadow rushed past, shocking people. A sinister silhouette appeared under the pale moon, wearing a mask and holding a sword. The frightened soldiers fell into a stupor at the sight of the approaching dark figure. The forest began to rustle, and this sound made their hearts sink into their heels. And then one of them screamed in panic, noticing the enemy. They mistook the swiftly flying Faith for a monstrous lich. Having hidden in the bushes, the guy noted with satisfaction that the prank had been a success. The gloomy cloak and bone mask created the perfect image of the undead. He reasoned that a loud appearance would certainly attract the attention of the right people. Suddenly my thoughts switched to the hated Rafal, whose name flashed in my head. Suddenly, the sensors detected someone rushing towards him. A sharp shout made Faith turn around in panic. The giant carcass was rushing towards him with frightening speed. The boy recognized the attacker with horror as the fierce Goblin Queen. The monster roared, and its red eyes burned with insane rage. Faith realized that the widow had come to avenge her murdered husband. A huge sword whistled through the air a centimeter away from him. A sword that completely overwhelms the enemy with madness. Under the mask, the guy's face was distorted with a dark and cold determination. Faith soared into the sky, transforming his weapon into a bow as he flew. The shining arrow was pulled back on the bowstring, ready to hit the target. The deadly arrow pierced the creature's eye socket with a precise crunch. The monster howled wildly as Faith calmly lowered his weapon. Looking at the enemy's agony, the guy only dryly asked for forgiveness. The Goblin Queen was literally torn apart by unbearable pain. Faith finished her off with his sword, mentally sending greetings to his late husband. Convinced of victory, he disappeared into the shadows, frightening the fleeing soldiers. Under the mask, the guy winced, realizing that he had gone overboard with the effects again. but such a commotion is guaranteed to force the holy knights to finally intervene. A couple of days later, Faith was planting trees as if nothing had happened. He wiped away the sweat, wondering why the knights were still hesitating. Faith hesitated, not having enough evidence against Rafal to talk. Suddenly, he froze with a shovel, noticing a familiar silhouette at the gate. Instead of her usual armor, Roxy shone in a light and delicate dress. She cheerfully declared that the gardener had come her way just in time. The girl solemnly announced that she had a task for him. Roxy playfully emphasized that the mission was top secret and important. Faith was surprised in the middle of the garden, not expecting spy passions from the lady. She commanded in a tone of voice to follow her on an inspection tour of the city. The guy was genuinely surprised, not understanding the point of such a strange check of the residence. As she approached, Roxy whispered that this expedition must remain a top secret. Roxy firmly stated that a knight must know the life of ordinary people. Faith enthusiastically supported this unexpected and noble idea of the lady. And then the girl literally dragged the resisting gardener into the city by force. Soon they found themselves in the middle of a bustling market, where Roxy's eyes lit up. Faith noted with surprise that this was the first time he had seen her so happy. The formidable warrior now seemed like an ordinary girl, longing for simple entertainment. Suddenly, the guy noticed that his companion was standing mesmerized at one of the counters. A variety of expensive jewelry sparkled enticingly on the velvet display case. Roxy was delighted at the low price, which took the poor man's breath away. While the girl was examining the goods, Faith was shocked to digest the cost of the trinket. In front of them lay a box of gray stones, promising only illusory luck. The merchant offered to try his luck for 10 coins, making Faith think. Roxy's eyes suddenly lit up with genuine childish excitement and curiosity. Faith secretly activated the evaluation, mentally apologizing to the merchant for cheating. He unmistakably chose the best stone and handed it to the girl with a smile. Roxy was embarrassed, but the guy insisted it was a sign of gratitude. Faith asked for the instrument, but decided to do something much more spectacular. He split the stone with his bare hands, scaring the merchant half to death with force. A happy Roxy raised the mind-blue crystal towards the bright sun. The precious stone sparkled dazzlingly against the sky, captivating with its purity. Faith smiled modestly, accepting the beaming girl's sincere thanks. Roxy hugged the gem tightly to her chest, promising to keep it safe. The guy scratched the back of his head in embarrassment, glad that the gift was liked. Suddenly their attention was drawn to a lonely child crying bitterly in the middle of the street. Roxy instantly became serious, declaring that they had an obligation to help the poor guy. The girl leaned towards the boy, trying to find out where his mother had disappeared to, but her excessive pressure and stern tone only frightened the child. The little boy began to sob even louder in panic, shying away from the strange lady. While Roxy was feeling down, Faith kindly offered to look for her mother together. The boy wiped away his tears and looked at the kind guy with hope. Faith encouraged the boy with a wide smile and a confident thumbs up. Holding hands, the three of them set off to comb the city streets. The sun was setting, and long searches were yielding no results. At the fountain, Faith gloomily noted that his mother was nowhere to be seen. He sensibly decided that there was no point in searching in the dark. It would be better to do it tomorrow. Hearing this, the boy shrank back, quietly and plaintively calling for his mother again. Roxy immediately offered him a place to stay for the night, promising to find her in the morning. But the child only trembled inconsolably, ignoring the outstretched helping hand. Suddenly, with the last of his strength, he screamed piercingly, breaking the silence of the evening. The heroes were surprised to hear a joyful and loud response in the distance. The woman in the blue dress rushed towards her son, glowing with pure happiness. The boy flew into the arms of his beloved mother with a cry of delight. They hugged tightly, finally reunited in the quiet twilight on the crowded street. Watching them, Faith and Roxy breathed a sigh of relief, happy about the happy ending. As they parted, the little rascal cheerfully called the heroes his brother and sister. Roxy waved to the departing family for a long time as the sun painted the city gold. Faith noted with a smile how much his mistress had become attached to the child. The girl turned around, and her face looked simply fabulous in the rays of the sunset. The guy instantly blushed, completely struck dead by such unearthly beauty. He began to make absurd excuses, desperately trying to hide his wild and intense embarrassment. Roxy remembered the stern maid and realized it was time to go back. Roxy jumped up abruptly, urging the lagging guy to follow her. Then suddenly, the girl mysteriously invited Faith to accompany her the following week. She smiled brightly, truly wanting to go on this journey together. Faith smiled sheepishly and readily accepted the invitation. And under the sunset sky, the two of them walked merrily along the city pavement. Later, in the carriage, Roxy suddenly asked him if the journey was a burden to him. The lady looked at him carefully, noticing a strange depression in his eyes. But in reality, Faith was simply trying to forget about his unpleasant enemies. He quickly started chattering about delicious grapes, trying to look as happy as possible. Roxy kindly teased Faith about his constant thoughts about food. The beauty remembered that these lands were once completely barren. Only through generations of hard work did the Hart family transform them into a flourishing land. The guy sincerely admired the beauty of the fields, calling these views truly wonderful. But suddenly Roxy's face darkened, talking about monsters destroying their work. The local kobolds turned out to be too dangerous creatures for ordinary guards. Because of their keen sense of smell and pack hunting, peasants cannot cope with them. Roxy resolutely promised that this time she would definitely deal with the threat. Meanwhile, Faith became embarrassed when Roxy noticed his sudden hunger. And then he realized that the souls of simple goblins were no longer enough for Glutton. The man called out to Roxy in alarm, noticing the sudden change in the surroundings. The girl immediately looked out to find out the reason for the commotion. Both froze in tension, seeing the dangerous forest predators blocking their path. Fierce creatures jumped out right at the carriage, which the heroes initially mistook for kobolds. However, they turned out to be airwolves, baring their fangs in anticipation of easy prey. And then the heroes came out to meet the flock, which had smelled them from afar. Roxy firmly ordered the guy to step back, preparing to deal with the insolent guys herself. She swung her sword confidently, calling these wolves just a weak warm-up. With a powerful, shining blow, the warrior instantly cut the attacking monsters in half. In fact, the title of Holy Knight was given only to such masters. Finally, the family estate came into view, and Roxy announced their return with relief. Inside, Lady Aisha greeted them, warmly welcoming her daughter back after a long separation. Roxy asked worriedly about how she was feeling, but her mother just waved her off cheerfully. Suddenly, the lady of the house turned her gaze to Faith, wondering who he was. The girl introduced him as a new servant, and the boy bowed politely and formally. The beautiful Aisha Hart introduced herself in response, giving Faith the kindest smile. The young man immediately felt that Roxy's mother was an incredibly bright person. Then suddenly Aisha asked Faith point blank if he liked Roxy. Both heroes blushed deeply, while their mother ironically clarified their sympathy for the hostess. But Faith admitted to himself that he was ready to serve his mistress forever. Faith was aware of the huge difference in status, but he had some dreams. Roxy suddenly became wildly embarrassed and began to playfully fiddle with her fingers in excitement. And then she flew out of the room like a bullet, leaving the guy in complete bewilderment. The hero sincerely did not understand how he could have offended the lady so much. Aisha kindly instructed the guy to always take care of Roxy, and he readily agreed. The work in the field dragged on, and the sun had almost disappeared behind the horizon. Faith realized that it was time to return to the estate as soon as possible. Suddenly, a menacing figure with a gigantic and gloomy axe appeared on the road. The poor fellow shuddered, seeing her ominously glowing red eyes in the twilight. Those eyes were frightening, because they were exactly like his own madness. Faith decided to activate the skill in order to quickly probe this mysterious stranger. The girl with the huge axe suddenly spoke, causing the guy to tense up quite a bit. Suddenly the skill returned nothing, completely missing the strange warrior's data. She sternly asked if the guy was even listening to her at the moment. Faith only timidly asked if there was anything he could do to help such a lady. The beauty mysteriously said that the time for their serious conversation had not yet come. She graciously gave him the kobolds, hinting at some future debt. The poor guy was completely taken aback, completely unable to understand her strange hints. As they parted, the stranger only dryly promised that they would definitely meet again. And then he realized, her scarlet eyes were frighteningly reminiscent of his own madness. Roxy called out to the boy in alarm, suddenly appearing on the forest path. The girl admitted that she had been looking for him for a long time, until the sun was setting. Roxy noticed his strange expression and immediately asked what happened. The guy waved his hands in panic, assuring the lady that everything was fine. The hero watched the warrior, wondering what Gallia was doing in these parts. Faith remembered the legends about the mysterious Gauls, which he had heard about before. Roxy confirmed that these people have almost completely disappeared from the face of the earth. Representatives of that race were distinguished by their dark skin and dazzling white hair. Once their great empire flourished, leaving behind only ruins. Roxy admitted that it was the first time she had seen someone so similar to them. Roxy suggested they go back home, noticing that her friend was quite exhausted. The beauty gently folded her palms, inviting Faith to quickly go to dinner. The boy enthusiastically agreed, promising to serve his mistress with joy. Suddenly at the table, Roxy pointed Faith to the seat right next to her. The poor man was surprised by such an honor, not believing that he would be sitting next to him. Meanwhile, the servants were pushing the embarrassed boy towards the chair next to the mistress. Faith sat on pins and needles, feeling extremely awkward in such company. Roxy cheerfully allowed him to forget about manners and just eat his fill. He timidly thanked the lady, completely captivated by her kindness and warmth, and then he began to devour the treats with gusto, forgetting his fears. After dinner, the maid saw Faith out, eagerly discussing their arrival. She was happy because Mrs. Roxy had not been so happy for a long time. The boy swore to protect her, remembering his dead father and sick mother. Later, Faith changed his clothes for the job, still thinking about that strange jackdaw. Those scarlet eyes clearly hinted at their eerie inner resemblance. But the girl's assessment skills simply produced a hole in the donut. Faith walked into the darkness, determined to figure it out at any cost. He had a gut feeling that the truth about Gaul would soon come out. Suddenly, in the night shadows, the carcasses of monsters flashed, ready to attack. The guy narrowed his eyes predatorily, turning on the assessment for a quick and hard interception. Greed noticed that enhancing parameters is a damn convenient thing. Suddenly, the sword commanded not to hesitate and to strike first. The guy rushed forward, snapping at the weapon that he himself knew everything. He deftly mowed down the monsters, receiving an average boost to all stats. But in reality, Faith clearly didn't have enough of a couple of kobolds. The sword suggested the fear of the enemies and reminded the lady of tomorrow's plans. And then the hero seriously doubted whether tomorrow would go smoothly. Meanwhile, a clear morning had arrived, ideal for harvesting grapes. Roxy beamed as the boy busied himself helping the peasants carry the heavy baskets. But as dusk fell, Faith went out on his night hunt again. Faith decided to have a nice meal before Roxy's kobold hunt tomorrow. He hid in the bushes, deciding for now to simply observe the scouts. Suddenly, a whole pack of ferocious creatures appeared from the forest darkness. Among them stood a leader, whom the voice in his head called the Crowned One. And then Faith was stunned by this frightening title. Sword advised using the assessment to find out the true strength of the monster. The Weeper's 6-digit stats made the guy sweat profusely in horror. The voice warned that Roxy alone would not be able to stand up to the entire army. Meanwhile, Faith realized that the horde had to be stopped here and now. And then he resolutely rushed into battle, overcoming his fear. Faith soared into the air, vowing to devour every monster in the pack. Suddenly, the huge leader roared, giving a furious order to his faithful dogs. The young man noticed the monster's caution as he directed the actions of his horde. And then he decided to change his position to set up a bloody ambush for the enemy. Meanwhile, Faith hid behind a boulder, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Then he quickly jumped down, catching his opponents off guard. The boy fired a magic arrow, vowing not to let the creatures near his domain. And then Gluttony activated, granting Faith a new skill of average agility. An incredible surge of strength made him literally scream with overwhelming energy. But in fact, his insatiable skill was simply completely delighted. The guy decided to look at the status to assess the fruits of his bloody harvest. His indicators had almost caught up with the leader. Only a couple of creatures remained to be finished off. And then Faith pulled the bowstring, wanting to personally greet the furry king. Suddenly, the ferocious creature blocked the shot, showing a reaction that was frightening for a monster. The young man instantly realized that their ambush had failed, and the position was completely exposed. Surrounded by a pack of kobolds, he found himself one step away from a shameful retreat. The guy just gritted his teeth, flatly refusing to back down in front of the enemy. Roxy's smile flashed before his eyes, reminding him which house he was fighting for. And then Faith furiously called upon the greed of his sword for the final throw. Meanwhile, a plan was hatched to devour the young until their strength became equal. Then he unleashed a rain of fire on his enemies, turning them into mincemeat. Faith gasped for air, feeling the insatiable hunger of his dark skill. The sword commanded that archery be combined with furious lunges in close combat. Suddenly the kobolds pressed him against the rock, giving him no room to maneuver. The guy gloomily noted that a frontal assault against this colossus would definitely not work. Meanwhile, he continued to sow death, cutting down the leader's minions one after another. A powerful explosion of blood confirmed that Gluttony had successfully consumed another life once again. But then the Crowned One gave the hero a powerful blow, almost knocking the wind out of him. The young man froze before the giant, realizing the true gulf in their physical strength. And then, with the last of his strength, he blocked the clawed paw, gritting his teeth. Faith gritted his teeth at the sheer power of this shaggy boss. And then the giant dealt a crushing blow, sending the boy flying back considerably. And then the crowned chieftain froze, radiating pure, concentrated rage. The sword's voice in his head ordered Faith to hold on until the very end. Suddenly, another attack from the monster blew the massive boulder to pieces. The young man finally realized that he was dealing with an incredible destructive force. Meanwhile, he collapsed to the ground under the heavy gaze of the predator. And then a huge paw with a crunching sound pressed the hero to the ground. But Faith only grabbed the limb of this impudent beast with fury. And then he slashed sharply at the paw, causing a fountain of blood to flow. The boy quickly plunged his blade into the monster, continuing his mad reaping. And then Gluttony activated again, completely inflating his stats to the sky. Faith challenged the leader, who had finally surpassed him in strength. Meanwhile, the interface confirmed, now the young man is officially cooler than this furry king. However, he felt such an aura of hatred that it sent shivers down his spine. The voice of the sword told me to pull myself together, because any moment of weakness would result in certain death. Suddenly, the crowned one unleashed such a powerful attack that the earth literally exploded. And then the guy cursed, amazed by the incredible destructive power of this mad beast. And then he took off running, trying to break the distance from the dangerous enemy. But in reality, Faith realized that bare numbers were no substitute for combat experience. And then Faith realized that the leader's blow was clearly not ordinary. The sword roared to Faith to pay attention to the enemy's special skill. The guy has unraveled the secret of a monster that can perform a crushing 1-inch strike. Meanwhile, he was feverishly thinking about how to defeat such a dangerous opponent. Suddenly, the sword told Faith to immediately change his form to a bow. The youth grumbled at the blade's impatience, but quickly summoned the shining weapon. And then Faith fired a powerful magic projectile straight into the crowd. But the boss dodged, and the shot only incinerated the ordinary kobold behind him. And then he realized the uselessness of the bow and the extreme danger of close combat. But in reality, the boastful weapon offered to wipe out the enemy with one blow. And then the sword demanded that part of the stats be fed to it for a powerful shot. They agreed on 10%, and the blade pulsed with ominous darkness in anticipation. Meanwhile, the leader was preparing to dash, unaware of the hero's trump card. The young man resolutely agreed to the deal, feeling the greedy excitement of his weapon. And then the blade thanked its owner for the treat, quickly absorbing his strength. And then the bow transformed, flaring with a frightening purple energy of pure destruction. Faith stared in amazement at the updated weapon, feeling its incredible power. A voice in my head told me not to be stupid, and to finish off this creature as soon as possible. Suddenly, Faith released the blood ptarmigan, illuminating the entire forest with a bright glow. A devastating beam pierced the leader, literally incinerating the monster on the spot. Faith was jubilant, because his cunning plan had worked and the leader had been defeated. Suddenly, the young man grabbed his head, screaming hysterically from terrible pain. Greed warned that a powerful soul could drive gluttony into a frenzy. The sword told the boy not to give up, so as not to completely lose his mind. Faith tried his best to fight furiously and not pass out. He soon recovered, enjoying the truly awesome combat experience he had gained. The young man sincerely hoped that this terrible power would no longer be needed. Suddenly, he looked around and was truly stunned. It turned out that Faith was standing on a lonely pillar of earth in the middle of complete emptiness. Greed added ironically that their victory simply had to be crushing. Faith was absolutely amazed at how quickly nature was restoring the landscape. And then, above the deep gorge, an incredibly clear starry sky stretched out. Meanwhile, the golden-haired warrior Roxy was already in full swing preparing for a serious hunt. Suddenly Faith jumped up in bed, realizing that he had shamefully overslept again. And then he flew out of the room like a bullet, afraid of disgracing his mistress. Caring Maya ironically greeted the sleepyhead, who finally deigned to wake up. The old woman explained that Roxy and her best fighters had already gone to fight the kobolds. But in fact, the guy was quite upset because he was left at home. Maya assured that the lady personally asked not to disturb his sweet sleep. Meanwhile, he continued to be amazed at the power left on the battlefield yesterday. Faith felt it was wrong to just sit back at a time like this. He was sure that he would help, because his feelings were sincere. Having found out the way, the guy immediately rushed to catch up with Roxy and the others. Suddenly, he jumped out into the clearing, breathing heavily and loudly. Meanwhile, Roxy was directing the workers in exactly where they needed to go. The girl knight was surprised by the meeting, and Faith referred to Maya's words. She warned about dangerous kobolds, but the hero refused to hide. And then Roxy was simply speechless from his disarming smile. But in reality, the guy won't calm down until he helps Roxy. Looking at the majestic gorge, he continued to be genuinely amazed by everything. Faith decided to hide the skill so as not to lose his newfound home. The guy asked Roxy what really happened here. Meanwhile, Roxy replied that it was all over without them. Someone unknown single-handedly dealt with an entire flock of kobolds, and then the girl assumed that this was the work of that Gaul. The Gauls were a warlike people who always smelled of blood. Faith was amazed to realize that the mysterious warrior had actually helped him out. Roxy considered it a theory, since the locals weren't capable of such things. Suddenly, the image of a red-eyed girl appeared, promising a new meeting. The guy was determined to repay her at the next opportunity. Roxy told Faith to get some rest, and he thanked her sincerely. The girl knight smiled radiantly, appreciating his timely and important help. Later, the guy walked thoughtfully down the corridor, digesting the events of a difficult day. Suddenly, he met Mrs. Aisha, who greeted him in a friendly manner. Faith was worried about her health, but Aisha assured her that she was cheerful. The woman offered to talk a little, and the guy happily agreed. But suddenly Aisha admitted that she felt her imminent end was near. A heavy cough interrupted her words, causing Faith to become seriously frightened. Meanwhile, Aisha shared that she is most worried about Roxy right now. She looked down sadly, realizing that she had almost no time. Faith sincerely didn't understand why Aisha decided to open up to him. She replied that she believed in his ability to genuinely support Roxy. The woman recalled how long it took her daughter to recover from her father's death. But next to Faith, the girl knight finally looked truly happy. Meanwhile, the guy hung his head, considering himself unworthy of such a high role. Roxy's constant support from the shadows seemed fundamentally wrong to him. Suddenly, Aisha gently covered his palm with hers, urging him to calm down. She assured him that everything was much simpler than he had imagined. And then she pointed to his chest, devaluing the importance of titles. In reality, only his soul and the honest impulses of his heart are important. Aisha entrusted Faith with the care of her daughter, sincerely believing in his powers. The guy was tormented by doubts before tomorrow's departure to the capital lands. Meanwhile, a squad of mercenaries made their way through the night forest to hunt. The soldiers were anticipating the profit, hoping to quickly recoup the cost of their new sharp blades. But suddenly they came across a mountain of corpses and a bloody massacre. And then, from the scarlet mist, a terrible lich with a blazing gaze appeared. Meanwhile, Roxy, in armor, resolutely headed towards the castle. Faith watched her with a heavy gaze, dreaming of a simple rest. Suddenly, the flimsy box fell apart, scattering oranges right onto the road. The old woman became alarmed, and the boy began to hastily apologize for his mistake. Faith realized with horror the side effect of the sudden increase in his characteristics. The old woman asked him about his well-being with concern, and the boy hastened to reassure her. He was moved to tears by the fact that strangers were so sincerely worried. The woman laughed good-naturedly, noticing how hungry their young assistant was. Meanwhile, the night hunter still could not get his fill of other people's souls. The sword noted that the absorbed soul of that very crowned kobold was to blame for everything. Faith hoped to maintain his sanity as long as regular hunting satisfied his endless hunger. But a voice in my head warned me that the consequences of prolonged fasting would be fatal. Suddenly, his right eye flared with unbearable pain under the lich's mask. And then, in the reflection of the blade, Faith saw his own eerie scarlet gaze. The eerie scarlet eye confirmed that the critical stage of hunger would come very soon. Suddenly he realized that nothing good awaited him ahead. The sword's voice in his head reminded him that there was almost no time to think. But in reality, Faith needed to urgently decide his fate. Meanwhile, the guy in the bandage diligently pretended to be an ordinary worker. The old man was surprised by the injury, but Faith cleverly lied about it being a freak accident. And then he energetically volunteered to help, hiding his wild thirst behind a smile. The gardener left the tree with Faith and calmly wandered off to work in the neighboring bushes. The hero responded cheerfully, although inside him everything was burning from endless hunger. While cutting the branches, he realized that goblins alone would definitely not be enough to feed him. Faith realized that the weak goblin blood no longer saturates his skill. Suddenly he noticed Roxy returning to the estate after a visit to the castle. The girl knight stood frozen in deep thought before the majestic monument to the warrior. Meanwhile, Faith began to secretly watch her, hiding behind the trees. Roxy suddenly turned around, feeling someone's attentive gaze on her. The guy awkwardly laughed it off, attributing the strange bandage to a ridiculous injury he had suffered that morning. The girl sternly asked him to take care of himself and be more careful in the future. And then Faith honestly admitted that she was behaving extremely unusually. But Roxy only smiled mysteriously, preferring to keep her thoughts to herself. In the end, she jokingly threatened him with a scolding from the strict gardener. Faith noticed that people in this house were always smiling. The entire garden seemed literally enveloped in an amazing and very kind aura. But in fact, the guy promised himself to protect people's happiness. Meanwhile, in the tavern, they were in full swing discussing the sudden return of the legendary dead man. Visitors believed that the holy knights would instantly finish off this dangerous creature. Suddenly, Faith's face darkened, trying to unravel the Blaric's secret and insidious plans. And then he firmly decided to get all the answers at any cost. Meanwhile, at the southern gate, Had was already giving orders with all his might. The rumors were confirmed because this knight personally went after the monster's head. The hero understood that the lich would not be able to stand against such a huge crowd. The scouts reported to Hadu about the goblin bodies found in the forest thicket. The knight realized that the frightening rumors about the dead man were true. Meanwhile, he ordered his subordinates to maintain order during the campaign. Hud confidently declared that he could easily deal with the dead man alone. In fact, the mercenaries planned to steal the gold while the commander was busy. Suddenly, one of the warriors noticed a strange figure ahead. Had ordered the squad to stop, peering at the eerie silhouette in the darkness. And then they saw the lich, who was sitting motionless on an old stump. The soldiers wondered if this stranger had actually defeated the Goblin King himself, but had only snorted arrogantly, considering his opponent completely harmless. Kato ordered to surround the enemy and attack strictly on his signal. He anticipated triumph, hoping to easily raise his authority with this victory. The knight mockingly commanded to begin. confident in his complete superiority. The archers simultaneously released their bowstrings, sending a whole swarm of arrows at the guy. Suddenly, Faith deflected the projectiles with lightning speed and one powerful circular strike. A stunned Kato realized that the young man had heard the moment of the shot in advance. The pursuers brazenly closed the ring, cutting off all escape routes for the poor fellow. The enemies mocked him, thinking that the guy was simply paralyzed by wild fear. Hadu pompously introduced himself as a holy knight, promising to crush the impudent disturber of order. The villains rolled with laughter, seeing the supposedly helpless and frozen young man. The henchman suggested that Hadu not get his hands dirty with such a helpless wretch. The proud knight graciously allowed his subordinates to finally get down to business. Suddenly Faith took off, stunning his enemies with his speed, and then Had, in horror, came face to face with a creepy skull mask. The next second, the guy scattered the attackers with one sharp, crushing lunge. The frightened soldiers began to run, ignoring the furious cries of their commander. Meanwhile, Faith slowly advanced, emitting a frightening and powerful dark aura. Had was completely furious, not wanting to look like a complete fool in front of everyone. Finally, Faith delivered the long-awaited greeting with satisfaction, and then it dawned on Had that he had heard this voice somewhere before. Had trembled with horror, suddenly recognizing the swordsman as a resident. Meanwhile, Faith coolly admitted that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. And then the knight broke loose, demanding immediate answers from the scum. Enraged, Had couldn't believe that this loser dared to give him orders. Suddenly, Faith sternly promised to extract the necessary truth at any cost. The knight pompously vowed to grind the insolent enemy into fine dust. And then the hero offered to show the enemy the real power of his title. Faith remembered the kind Roxy, for whom he was obliged to win the fight. And then he decided to devour the essence of the corruption sown around him. Finally, the swordsman assessed the enemy's combat characteristics through the magical interface. Had mockingly urged Faith to attack, goading him for his obvious cowardice. Meanwhile, the guy assessed the threat of the enemy's holy sword skill. He remembered the old tale about invincible knights with elite weapons, and then Faith decided to see with his own eyes their most powerful blow. Suddenly, he asked Greed about the real danger of this shiny thing. The black sword only chuckled sarcastically, promising to easily crush the pathetic parody. At that very second, Faith rushed into the attack, provoking Had. In response, Had maliciously promised the hero a quick death by sword, and then he turned on the great cross, filling the area with a pathetic glow. Finally, the knight shouted about a purifying light that could incinerate anyone. Suddenly, Faith appeared behind Had, caustically reproaching him for his slowness. And then the guy revealed to the enemy the truth about his colossal superiority and strength. Meanwhile, Greed easily cut through the pompous holy sword of the arrogant knight. A stunned Had stared in horror at the useless fragment of his greatest pride. And then Faith ironically told his opponent to take back his fragile trash. Suddenly, the once great knight collapsed shamefully onto the grass, screaming hysterically. But the swordsman jerked the enemy up by the throat, ordering the holy woman not to lie down. And then Faith announced the beginning of a tough lesson for the disobedient dog. Suddenly, a wild cry of pain from the completely broken had pierced the area. Finally, the guy mockingly assessed the new, rather rumpled appearance of his offender. Broken, Had humbly begged for mercy, and to finally end this torture. Meanwhile, Faith angrily recalled the lost lives and tears because of the scoundrel. The boy was sincerely amazed at the knight's audacity to ask for mercy after what he had done. And then the swordsman with a powerful jerk sent the enemy's battered body flying. Faith fed Greed some of his stats, activating the bloody Termagant's devastating skill. The voice of the sword in his head anticipated a noble treat, an easy execution of the order. Suddenly, a powerful stream of dark energy fell on Had, tearing apart his armor. And then the wounded knight collapsed into a pool of blood, unable to resist. The swordsman noted that only the knight's elite stats helped him not to die. Finally, Hud finally broke down and meekly agreed to tell Faith the whole truth. Had let it slip that the elite knights had gone off on a long mountain expedition. Meanwhile, Faith strictly ordered to lay out everything that concerns Mistress Roxy. Suddenly, an intrigue arose. Tomorrow the girl would be forcibly sent to dangerous Gaul. And then the guy was surprised, because it was there that her father had once died tragically. But in reality, the heavenly dragon of Gaul began to rapidly terrorize the area. They decided to stop the creature by making Roxy an obedient and powerless living victim. Faith immediately realized that this was the vile work of the vile holy knights. Meanwhile, the beaten had confirmed that the entire top brass was involved in the conspiracy. And then the swordsman realized what exactly those bastards were talking about at the meeting. Finally, he asked if Roxy had simply accepted this abuse. Suddenly, he realized that Roxy had actually been sent to certain death. Had admitted that the knights had unanimously decided to make the girl a living sacrifice. It turned out that kind Roxy was ready to happily die to save the residents. And then Faith gripped the handle furiously, refusing to accept such injustice. Meanwhile, the defeated enemy pitifully begged for his life, promising to quickly improve. But the guy shut the mouth of this vile holy man forever with one clear blow. But in reality, absorbing the powers of such a worthless thing only caused nausea. Greed announced the opening of the second level, and the swordsman ordered him to act. The hero was literally sickened by the realization that part of Cod was now inside him. And then the sword's voice burst into laughter, beginning the process of absorbing new characteristics. Faith gained a level, and Greed became a creepy, huge black scythe. Suddenly he realized that the damned blade cuts through absolutely everything. And then the swordsman suddenly jumped up, shouting Roxy's name in horror. But in reality, the terrifying scene turned out to be just a nightmare. Meanwhile, Faith realized that after waking up, his memory was failing him. The guy tossed and turned in bed, realizing that sleep was definitely gone now. Suddenly he noticed that the wild hunger had finally subsided a little. The swordsman wondered why Roxy had hidden the truth about the danger from him. And then Greed caustically teased the owner for his own secrecy. Meanwhile, Faith got angry, telling the chatty sword to just shut up quickly. However, Faith decided that there was no point in worrying any further now. Meanwhile, the guy remembered how he hunted goblins after resetting his characteristics. And then he wondered if Lady Roxy would survive her encounter with the dragon. Suddenly, Greed moralized that a true warrior must know how to rest. Faith, in a rage, told the sword to shut up while it was mocking its owner. Meanwhile, the talkative blade noticed that for some reason it had become too noisy outside. And then he realized that something truly strange was happening beyond the threshold. Suddenly he rushed to the door, wanting to immediately find out the reason for the commotion. The guy ran down the corridor as fast as he could, feeling anxiety growing in his chest. In fact, Roxy was already surrounded by a crowd of sobbing servants seeing her off. Roxy greeted him in the morning with a dazzling and incredibly gentle smile. A sudden order sent the girl straight to the deadly gall. Faith cried out in despair that this was the dastardly machinations of the enemies. He reminded her of her father's fate, but she understood everything. The knight was determined to finish the job started by her deceased parent. Smiling sincerely, she thanked the guy for his strong concern. The battle with the monsters promised to drag on for 3 long years. Faith's heart sank as the sky dragon attacked much earlier. According to old information, the enemy was already approaching the borders. This living disaster threatened Roxy with imminent and cruel death. The guy realized with horror that even her strength would not be enough for survival. But Roxy just smiled, promising to definitely return safe and sound. The girl offered him to live and work peacefully on her safe lands. Faith was shocked that in the face of death she was only worried about him. He couldn't ask to follow, cursed by his terrible greedy skill. The hero realized with bitterness that he had no right to stop her. Suddenly the knight showed the same cheap amulet that had once been given to him. This simple trinket became her most precious and heartwarming treasure. Roxy proudly put on the jewelry, coquettishly asking his honest opinion. Faith, holding back tears, quietly replied that it suited her perfectly. Roxy smiled warmly at the end, promising to definitely meet. The guy sadly mentally wished the lady good luck on her journey. Returning home, he quickly changed into his black combat gear. Greed noted sarcastically that his owner had finally made a decision. Faith was determined to follow the girl as a free warrior. Hiding his face with a creepy mask, he vowed to secretly protect Roxy. It was painful for the hero to say goodbye to the good people of this estate, but this step was necessary to save the knight's life. Throwing his things over his shoulder, the Grim Reaper walked out into the street. Leaving the city behind, Faith set out to meet his cruel fate. Faith remembered with nostalgia the times when he stood here as a simple gatekeeper. He mentally asked his past self if he was happy with his current path. The boy realized how much he had changed when he went to Gaul as a warrior. Memory brought back bitter images of humiliation from the arrogant holy knights, but they were immediately replaced by happy moments next to Roxy. Having said goodbye to the city, the hero stepped into the fog, hoping to return one day. Suddenly, memories took him to an old house under the starry sky. The bloody spear stood there while the little boy treated his father. Young Faith bandaged his parent's injured arm with utmost care. The father watched with affection as his son proudly finished the bandaging. The father noticed his son's skill, and he, in turn, noticed his too frequent injuries. Smiling through force, the father apologized and stroked the child's head. He suggested going to his mother, and the boy nodded willingly. Holding hands, they wandered through the sun-drenched meadows. Soon, the travelers stopped at a burial mound with a rough cross. Young Faith mentally begged his mother to protect his father. Suddenly, he noticed how difficult and painful it was to pray to a parent. The man asked his son to take care of himself so as not to upset his mother. But then he smiled brightly, wanting to continue his prayer. Faith woke up abruptly in reality to the mocking voice of Greed. It turned out that the guy had dozed off in a public carriage that was shaking along the road. Faith was outraged by the laughter of the sword, which considered him a small child. The hero looked out the window, assessing the considerable distance they had covered. The charioteer loudly announced his imminent arrival in the city of Tetra. The guy thoughtfully repeated the name of the place, which was previously unfamiliar to him. The cozy streets of the city, bathed in the warm light of the sunset, opened up to our gaze. The city turned out to be smaller than the capital, but still quite lively. Faith consulted the map, plotting his route further south. Gaul was much further away, and it was necessary to find another passing wagon. Unable to find transport, he decided to spend the night waiting for Roxy, who was lagging behind. Faith realized that his boss had deliberately provided him with money for the trip because she understood his plans. He remembered how he had been here before on his way to the capital. At that time, the boy, dying of hunger, could not appreciate the beauty of the city. And then the stomach began to rumble again, demanding immediate, filling food. The guy resolutely entered the noisy, crowded tavern. The bartender kindly asked for the order, and Faith asked for advice. The man happily offered wine and soup for 20 coins. The hero grinned, immediately lowering the price to 15. While waiting for his order, he carefully surveyed the diverse crowd in the hall. Noisy merchants and stern mercenaries sat at the tables mixed together. Faith thought with irony that the mercenaries were charging prices only for appearance. Just then, his hot dinner with a glass of wine arrived. The hungry hero sincerely thanked heaven for this simple food. He decided to go south, eating monsters and collecting rumors along the way. The idyll was suddenly broken by a sharp cry, forcing Faith to turn around. In the middle of the hall, an unfortunate man on his knees begged the warriors for protection. The bald mercenary haughtily refused, not wanting to dirty his hands for pennies. He mockingly advised the petitioner to humiliate himself much more convincingly. The poor man hit his head on the floor in despair, begging to save his family. The big guy grinned smugly, as if this was the very sight he had been waiting for. The impudent man brazenly demanded 10 gold coins as a deposit for help. He rudely told the beggar to look for protectors elsewhere. The poor man pleaded, but the mercenary kicked him in anger, demanding silence. The big guy swung, growling that he didn't care about that hole, and then Faith lightning fast intercepted the fist flying towards his face. The guy advised him to stop in an icy tone, shocking the attacker. The hero squeezed his enemy's hand with a crunch, breaking his bones. The mercenary howled pitifully in pain, begging to let go of his hand. Faith told him to sit down and finish his soup in silence. The guy was surprised, not expecting to meet this old acquaintance here. Faith, with a wry grin, recognized the trembling petitioner as his old friend Seth. Seth shuddered, suddenly recognizing the dangerous warrior as that very same Faith. Suddenly, my memory brought back images of Seth viciously bullying the little hero. Meanwhile, in the past, this impudent man showered the defenseless child with a hail of insults. But in reality, the boy only cried pitifully and begged to stop. Now the former tormentor was lying at the warrior's feet, desperately begging for help. Seth tearfully begged Faith to save their village from certain death. And then the guy remembered how much pain and humiliation this man had caused him. But once upon a time, this scoundrel even mercilessly burned down the orphan's only house. Meanwhile, Seth was now humiliatedly pressing himself to the floor, promising any redemption. Faith realized that without his help, no one would help the village. Terrible creatures tormented the residents, and they could only scare them away. Poor Sito needed strong warriors to save his people. Suddenly he fell to his knees, predicting the imminent destruction of the house. Faith agreed to go, deciding at the same time to visit the graves and satisfy his hunger. Meanwhile, he stunned his companion by demanding that they set out immediately. Sato was afraid of the night fog and the monsters that flocked to any light, and Faith only coldly replied that it would be easier to exterminate the enemies that way. The sword reminded the hero of the kobolds, causing him to become more serious. And then it became clear that the village was in mortal danger. Sato hesitated, but Faith ordered him to simply follow him into the darkness. The guy admitted that now Faith is the only warrior capable of saving them all. The hero was surprised by his new status as a protector in the eyes of his old acquaintance. The companion trailed behind, amazed at how much his former neighbor had changed. Faith remembered how he once ran in terror down this road. Suddenly, an ugly and bloodthirsty goblin jumped out of the bushes at the travelers. Faith instantly cut the creature down, ordering his frightened comrade to move away. Shocked, Sito thanked his savior, because the hero's power seemed incredible to him. The eyewitness realized that Faith's skill went far beyond mere luck. They hurried further into the night forest, ignoring any dangers around them. Faith noticed strange birds and was surprised by their activity at such a late hour. The companion suddenly turned to the hero, wanting to clarify one very important point. Sato timidly asked if Faith still hated their home village. The hero honestly admitted that he cherished only the memory of his parents there. The guy remembered his past cruelty and once again confirmed his hatred of people. Meanwhile, the travelers finally reached the gates of the sleeping and gloomy settlement. The companion suggested going straight to the elder so that he could explain everything in detail. Suddenly he bowed low, tearfully begging Faith to protect them from the monsters. Images of how Sato had previously bullied him flashed through the hero's head. Faith only sighed resignedly, realizing that this was exactly the outcome he had expected. At the entrance to the village, the travelers were surrounded by a crowd of hostile residents. The villagers showered Sato with reproaches and accused Faith of wanting revenge. Sato desperately tried to convince the crowd that Faith had come to save them. The panic-stricken people completely lost their minds due to fear of the monster. Faith felt a sharp pain as his cursed skill began to awaken again. Hunger whispered to the hero that it was vital for him to go hunting immediately. The elder apologized for his son's weakness and promised to personally find help the following morning. The residents trembled at the thought that the monster could appear much before dawn. Suddenly, one madman suggested feeding Faith to the monster in order to save the settlement. The hero realized with bitterness that his fellow tribesmen were going to use him as bait. The sword's voice laughed mockingly at the crowd's desire to sacrifice Faith. The hero decided to act tough since things had taken such a lousy turn. Sato desperately prayed for Faith to ignore those crazy and angry shouts. Meanwhile, Faith decided to simply step back and let his friend clean up the mess himself. The elder rudely ordered his son to go on guard duty and not to mess up anymore. The stern father warned that his patience had run out, and there would be no protection. Soon they were left alone in the middle of the empty and eerily quiet streets of the village. Faith recalled with displeasure the attempt to feed him to the monster, and Sato apologized guiltily. And then the companion timidly invited the hero to spend the night in his house that night. He added sadly that Faith's old shack had long since fallen into ruin. Faith figured that this option was much better than spending the night in a regular tent. The hero accepted the offer, and Sato immediately led him towards the house. At the threshold they were joyfully greeted by a little girl, who called her companion her dad. The man tenderly hugged his daughter, forgetting for a moment about all the horrors of the night. Faith was quite shocked to learn that his old friend had a child. The hero looked around and asked directly where the mother of this family had gone. Sato's face darkened and he quietly admitted that his wife had been torn to pieces by that monster. And then Faith realized the true reason for the despair in this man's eyes. The little girl curiously asked who exactly had come to visit them. Father introduced Faith as a great warrior capable of protecting them from harm. The little girl burst into tears, hoping that this cool warrior would avenge her mother. Faith remembered the bitter past when no one helped him in difficult times. The girl timidly asked to have dinner together because her grandparents were scaring her. And then Sato tenderly hugged his daughter, promising to never leave her again. The guy was amazed at how much his old enemy had changed after all the trials. Previously, Sato only blindly believed his father, but fatherhood changed everything dramatically. How suddenly it turned out that marriage helped him finally start thinking independently. Faith concluded that only this man was able to start his life anew. The familiar taste of his father's porridge suddenly stirred up warm memories in the hero's soul. In the end, he admitted that he returned here for the sake of the memory of his loved ones. Faith asked Sato to reveal absolutely every known detail about the local monster. The companion described a winged creature with horns and frighteningly sharp long claws, but in fact, the hero immediately realized that these were cunning gargoyles. He explained the pack's tactics of creating the false appearance of a small number of enemies. Meanwhile, Faith wondered when exactly these vile creatures would decide to attack. Suddenly it dawned on the guy that the perfect night had arrived today. Sword was looking forward to a rich dinner, and Faith rudely ordered him to shut up. A frightened Sato hugged his crying daughter tightly, sensing something was wrong in the silence. The hero strictly ordered the family to stay at home and not open the door. And then he saw in the sky a flock of monsters thirsty for fresh flesh. Faith applied the analysis and assessed the gargoyles' characteristics as rather average. He realized that the monsters were about to begin a massive fire bombardment from above. With his first powerful swing, the guy knocked the flying creature to the ground. The hero was ironically delighted at the opportunity to add magical fire to his arsenal. Suddenly Faith noticed the murdered elder and became very worried about the evacuation. The sword's voice commanded Faith to immediately transform it into a deadly scythe. The boy prepared to experience the true power of this new and formidable form. The magic instantly dissipated, because black steel could destroy any phenomenon. The fireballs were becoming too numerous, and Faith was barely able to defend the house. And then he shouted that the concentration of enemies would only make his job easier. Faith stood with a huge scythe against the backdrop of the sky and falling enemies. The hero ordered the sword to use the general technique despite the enormous risk. Suddenly, like a devastating whirlwind, he rushed through the ranks of winged monsters. After the battle, the sword praised Faith, but he only modestly waved it off. The next moment, the guy accurately pierced another tenacious creature with a magic arrow. And then the weapon warned its owner in time about the danger right above him. The huge leader of the pack hovered above, ready to rain down deadly flames upon him. Analysis showed that this enemy is much stronger than all previous gargoyles. Faith instantly realized that the true leader of the pack stood before him. Meanwhile, the monster decided to shoot point blank, hoping to quickly incinerate the warrior. Faith sternly warned that the enemy was literally asking to be killed. The gluttony skill activated, instantly granting the boy the required fire resistance. And then he realized he had acquired fireball magic. The young man looked around the burning village, where almost no one survived. And then Faith felt a frightening cold emptiness in his chest. Suddenly someone called him loudly, tearing him out of his gloomy stupor. He jumped down to Seth, who was anxiously asking about what had happened. He told of the invasion of monsters and their devastating flames. Despite his dislike, Faith felt a strange pity for the ashes. One thing is clear. Today he has lost his home village forever. Faith walked silently to the overgrown stones that served as his parents' graves. Suddenly he tenderly greeted his family, finally reaching home. The guy apologized for his long absence and began to clear away the weeds around him. Having finished his work, he assessed the updated appearance of the monuments with a sad smile, and then he remembered his father's old command to always smile. The parent confirmed that this is the secret of their eternal optimism. Meanwhile, Faith promised his father to never stand still. He confessed to the graves that he was ready to go to Gaul for Roxy, but in fact, he vowed to return the lady home safe and sound. Finally, the young man resolutely left the place of rest, rushing towards his goal. Suddenly, the ghostly silhouettes of his parents warmly wished Faith good luck. The young man froze, not believing his eyes and feeling slightly numb. Soon a soft, sincere, and calm smile blossomed on his face. Meanwhile, enraged residents accused him of treason and conspiracy. The little girl clung to her protector in fear, trembling with fear. Faith calmly replied that he was planning to leave the village forever anyway. And then he got ready for battle, remembering the terrible attack of the monsters. The guy resolutely promised to deal with that impudent bastard first. Seth apologized sincerely, but Faith did not blame his friend for what happened. The young man confirmed that he had finally visited his parents' final resting place. Seth told the girl to go home and wait for his quick return. Suddenly, the blonde man furiously demanded that Faith hit him with all his strength. The young man was surprised while Seth kept repeating his desire to finally take responsibility. He acknowledged his guilt for the past and wanted to strengthen his resolve. Faith was genuinely perplexed, not understanding the reasons for such a strange request. Meanwhile, Seth announced his final departure to Tetra for work. The guy nodded briefly, accepting the serious attitude of his old acquaintance. However, before parting, Seth again asked the hero to strike an honest blow. The sword found the situation amusing and ordered a backhand strike. Finally, Faith told Seth to grit his teeth and clenched his fist. Faith gave Seth a good beating, sending him flying into a tree. The young man was quite frightened, realizing that he had clearly overdone the force of the blow. He rushed towards the bushes, anxiously inquiring about the health of his fallen friend. Suddenly, Seth let out a loud neigh, hanging awkwardly upside down in the branches. And then Faith remembered his father, who laughed in exactly the same way. He always made fun of any difficulties and never became depressed for long. Later in the city, Seth thanked the hero for the safe walk to the place. Suddenly, the man came to his senses, remembering that he had completely forgotten to count out the coins. But the guy flatly refused to accept his honestly earned fee. Faith told me to spend the money on my daughter, because he himself didn't need it at all. Seth was effusive in his gratitude, as this money would truly save their family. Faith said a warm goodbye to his friends, wishing them the brightest future. The baby and Seth joyfully shouted to the hero that he should definitely come back. The guy set off on his journey, finally leaving behind the ashes of his home. But in fact, a dangerous stranger was already following him. Soon, Faith hired himself out as a guard on a wagon, deciding to save a lot of money on the road. The driver grumbled and ordered his fellow traveler to stop yawning so brazenly and openly. Suddenly, the man began to doubt that this frail young man really knew how to fight. Faith casually threw something that was comparable in strength to even the Holy Knight. The companion, in horror, told the boy not to talk such dangerous nonsense. The driver warned that in the city of the Holy Knights, his chatter would become deadly. Faith decided to keep quiet, dreaming only of a sound sleep in the new city. The sword sarcastically remarked that the guy would have a good night's sleep after the fight with the knight. The weapon called the hero simple-minded, but quite worthy of wielding great power. Suddenly, a powerful explosion threw the cart up, interrupting their calm conversation. Meanwhile, the bandits blocked the road, completely surrounding the old man and the young man. The guy cursed under his breath, realizing that he had relaxed too much on the way. Sword called him a useless bodyguard, for which he was ordered to shut up. The frightened driver prayed that Faith would deal with this gang quickly. The robbers only laughed, anticipating the fat loot in the pockets of the false knight. The frightened old man grabbed Faith with a death grip, preventing him from fighting properly. The guy sighed resignedly, realizing that it would not be possible to resolve this conflict peacefully. He glanced at the bandits, hoping to simply intimidate the small fry with his bow. Suddenly the robbers rushed at the defenseless cart with a wild cry. A mysterious white-haired maiden with a huge braid gracefully swooped down from the sky. A crushing blow shattered the ground, instantly scattering the stunned enemies. The young man froze, shocked by the appearance of such a powerful and unexpected ally. Taking a closer look, he had difficulty recognizing his old acquaintance in this warrior. The guy instantly remembered their last meeting on the Heart territory. Faith really couldn't figure out what the hell this dangerous person was doing here. The white-haired warrior coldly noted that they had finally met again. The driver thanked the savior and asked her to quickly clear the road. However, the guest snapped that from now on she would go with them. The old man was quite stunned by such impudence from such a young person. Faith noted that the bandits survived, although they looked like crap. The young man was wondering who this strange person was in front of him. The stranger confidently stepped on board, without waiting for a special invitation. Suddenly the cart tilted dangerously and creaked under her weight. The guy was truly shocked by how heavy the girl turned out to be. She just casually told Despondency to stop being so heavy. The poor driver almost had a heart attack from this strange scene. But in fact, this axe simply knew how to change its weight. Meanwhile, the mysterious girl suddenly asked what our hero's name was. She glared at Faith, demanding he give up his name immediately. The guy introduced himself honestly, telling his new acquaintance his full name. Mine sarcastically promised to remember Faith of Gluttony, which immediately alerted the guy. And then he was really surprised, because she knew his secret skill. The girl admitted that she also possesses one of the great deadly sins. The young man was stunned, trying to comprehend the scale of the sudden news. The formidable warrior called the boy immature, and revealed her secret of wrath. The girl asked if Greed had been talking about her, but he remained silent. Faith thought about the anger skill, deciding not to bring it up in front of others. Suddenly, his companion called him a debtor, promising to follow him everywhere. Meanwhile, the guy immediately understood what kind of case was being discussed. Faith spoke of difficulties, but she too was planning a route to Gaul. And then she looked up, demanding help on this long journey. Sensing a clear threat, Faith quickly agreed to avoid ending up like the bandits. The girl was happy with the deal, but the guy just smiled wryly and resignedly. Then suddenly she just went to bed right in the middle of their important conversation. But Greed always insisted that the master rests at every opportunity. The coachman joyfully announced that they had finally reached the city of the Holy Knights. Before them lay a majestic city, securely protected by a high, snow-white stone wall. Looking at the fortifications, Faith felt a strange, oppressive atmosphere of the complete isolation of the place. The fellow traveler explained that power here is held by knights through a strict hierarchy of skills. Suddenly, the man drew the hero's attention to the strange tattoos of the locals. It turned out that these marks forever branded the serfs belonging to the Holy Knights. Faith shuddered at the thought of such a life and thanked fate for his origin. However, the coachman reassured me that this terrible system did not apply to visitors. The guy felt a tremendous sense of relief, as his freedom was not yet in any danger. The old man added that the warriors here are guaranteed special honor and a comfortable existence. Faith politely declined the offer to stay, citing urgent matters. The coachman pointed to the hotel, which was located directly ahead on the road. Shiny gold coins migrated into the old man's palm for honest work. Finally, the driver sternly warned the boy against any clashes with the knights. Faith called out to the soundly sleeping mine, trying to finally bring her to her senses. The girl continued to snore sweetly, completely unresponsive to external stimuli. The guy began to persistently shake her shoulder, urging her to wake up immediately. Greed warned that waking her up was a disastrous idea. The sword explained that in anger this girl would instantly destroy the entire city. Seeing no other way out, Faith resignedly lifted the sleeping sleepyhead onto his back. Faith dragged mine while Greedy recalled their strange shared past. The sword philosophically advised simply accepting the inevitable proximity to this girl. The guy became agitated by the omissions, but Greed abruptly cut off all questioning. Sword waved him off rudely, declaring that this story had nothing to do with him. Meanwhile, the hero wondered if his partner's huge axe could talk. And then he noticed that the eerie black blade was also snoring peacefully. The greedy man contemptuously called the lazy weapon Despondency, confirming the guy's suspicions. Faith was irritated by his partner's secrecy, and he only grumbled at his annoying colleagues. In the end, Greed reluctantly agreed to tell about other similar artifacts. The power of the deadly sin weapons proved to be many times greater than that of holy swords. Faith inquired about the presence of other brethren, but Greed only remained mysteriously silent. The hero ironically asked his partner not to act like an overly shy guy. The boy wondered if Despondency absorbed other people's characteristics for its great power. Soon, a huge hotel appeared before them, striking in its truly imperial proportions. Inside, Faith was amazed by the abundance of shops operating specifically for all visiting travelers. The pretty girl at the reception politely welcomed the new guests of this harsh city. The hero asked for one room for two, and the employee bowed politely. Suddenly, Faith noticed the shameful mark of a serf slave on her neck. The woman handed over a golden key and began talking about some important rules. She sternly warned that the actions of all travelers here are strictly limited. The girl strictly instructed guests not to let their guard down outside the hotel. First tattoos, now prohibitions. Faith realized that life here is not easy. The hero was amazed by the size of the building and inquired about the total number of living rooms. The interlocutor explained that the 5 huge floors accommodate 2,500 rooms. The guy was incredibly surprised, because even the capital's hotels were half the size. The receptionist assigned an assistant and allowed the heroes to keep their weapons. Faith politely thanked the staff, knowing that he would definitely get lost on his own. The employee called the hotel the pride of the city, and the hero only eagerly agreed. Meanwhile, she asked whether the guests from the capital had come for the hunting. And then the mention of some sand people left Faith completely stupefied. The hostess told about sand monsters that often infest the entire area. Faith grinned predatorily, delighted at the opportunity to level up on these monsters. The woman invited the guests to have dinner in a nice restaurant on the ground floor. The creatures lived in the sands, turning any greenery into a lifeless desert. Local warriors fought desperately against them to save the forests and meadows. The guy immediately realized that these creatures were causing a lot of trouble for the residents. The interlocutor poured tea, complaining about the constant threat to their usual way of life. Destroying the red core inside the monster seemed like a fairly simple matter to Faith. She mentioned the profitable sale of cores, and wished the guy a great vacation. The girl immediately noticed Mine sleeping on the bed. The hostess suddenly praised his sweet girlfriend, putting the guy in an awkward position. Faith screamed in panic about the mistake, but the woman only ran away giggling. Mine slept like a log, so he decided to hunt solo. Having scribbled a note for Sonia, the guy quietly got ready to leave. The sword asked sarcastically if he was afraid of the wrath of the awakened fury. Faith waved it off confidently, as if to say, "Everything will be fine, don't worry." And then he realized it was time for a little masquerade. A skull mask appeared in his hands, so that no one would recognize the hero by face. Having put it on, he pompously proclaimed the birth of the mysterious corpse warrior. Now he could crush monsters without revealing his true identity. Greed asked not to escalate the situation while the guy went out into the corridor. He noticed that there was no room to swing a cat below because of the crowd of sand people hunters. Not wanting to be discovered, Faith slipped sideways out of sight. Suddenly his stomach twisted with a brutal, unnatural hunger. One eye was already filled with an eerie scarlet light, betraying thirst. Sword noticed that the cursed skill was controlling the boy too easily. The weapon suggested fighting on an empty stomach to strengthen the will. Faith grimaced, because it was hellishly difficult to endure such wild withdrawal. However, I had to admit, I need to learn to keep my inner demon in check. Otherwise, the insatiable skill will simply devour his personality without a trace. Faith reluctantly acknowledged the sword's correctness, realizing the mortal danger of losing control. The guy decided to follow the squad in order to reach the monster's lair. In the pitch darkness, the warriors walked confidently, without even lighting torches. Faith noticed the fighters were wearing special magical night vision goggles. Without these artifacts, hunting night monsters would be suicide. Such rare technologies from Gaul must have cost a fortune. Sitting on a branch, the hero realized his superiority over ordinary people. Suddenly the squad below froze, clearly sensing something was wrong in the darkness. Faith wanted cool gadgets, but the sword dismissed the idea. With the gluttony skill, he really didn't need these toys. The sword snorted contemptuously, calling other people's artifacts useless junk for weaklings. Faith chuckled, because with greed and the mask he was fully equipped. The weapon suddenly barked, demanding that we not be distracted and keep an eye on the fleeing target. Ahead stretched endless dunes, swallowing up the once flourishing lands to the horizon. The sand people slowly but surely conquered new territories from the world. The hero thought with sadness that one day the desert would swallow up absolutely everything. And then from below came the panicked cries of soldiers who had noticed the enemy ambush. Horrible sand golems erupted from the ground, furiously attacking the squad. At the sight of his enemies, Faith's brutal hunger flared up with redoubled force. The guy clenched his hand, preparing to turn this fight into a tough workout. Having activated evaluation, Faith decided to scan the stats of these creepy sand creatures. The monsters were powerful, but their snail's pace made victory easy. At the sight of the flame, the guy realized that fire was the main vulnerability of these freaks. Without knowing the location of the core, the soldiers simply burned the enemies with magic. Faith snorted in disappointment, calling such a safe tactic deadly boring. He just wanted to smash everything to pieces with one powerful blow. But for the sake of controlling his hunger, he decided to moderate his ardor for now. Greed supported the idea of saving destructive power for a more worthy cause. And then the partners took off, starting their wild hunt. Shrouded in darkness, Faith swooped down on the first sand monster he came across. With a savage grin, Faith released a roaring fireball at the enemy. The sand golem froze in bewilderment, looking at the flaring flame. The monster just laughed, mocking the boy's pathetic attempt at magic. Realizing the failure, the weapon demanded to immediately change its form to a bow. Holding the black bow in his hands, Faith decided to cheat. Greed told him to visualize the fireball right as he fired. Skeptically pulling the bowstring, the warrior nevertheless trusted the strange advice. And then a powerful arrow, engulfed in flames, burst from the bow. A fiery projectile fell from the sky, incinerating the screaming monster. In the midst of the conflagration, the satisfied weapon immediately demanded praise for its success. Breathing heavily, Faith decided to endure the hellish hunger to the last limit. All that was left was to blindly trust the weapon's instinct, sitting in complete uncertainty.